One of the major drawbacks to selling covered calls is the fact that we need to have 100 shares of a specific stock to sell calls on. It's not the most capital efficient strategy, but there is a more efficient way to sell calls, and this is what we call a poor man's covered call, otherwise known as PMCC. So instead of buying 100 shares of a stock, we'll simulate that by buying a deep in-the-money leaps call, long-dated high delta option. You can then sell short-dated call options on top of it. That might be a lot, so let's break it down step by step. So that deep in-the-money leaps call option, what we're going to do is we're going to aim for a delta of 0.85 to 0.95. What that simulates is essentially owning around 85 to 95 shares of that particular stock. And with the fact that we're selling it really far out, long-dated, means that most of the theta decay is going to be very, very slow. What that essentially means is that this one call option that's far out and very in the money is going to simulate almost a one-to-one move with the stock. Once we own that long-dated leaps call, we can then start selling shorter DTE call options on top of it, similar to what we would do with covered calls. That is essentially what a poor man's covered call is. That can be a little bit confusing, so let's just demonstrate with an example. For the leaps call that we're buying, we want to be buying one that is around 1.5 to 2.5 years out. And we want to be buying it when it's at 0.85 to 0.95 delta. Let's use TSM as an example. Right now, TSM is around $280. So if we wanted to buy 100 shares of TSM to sell covered calls on, we'll spend close to $28,000. So in order to simulate that 100 shares, what we're going to do is we're going to go and buy a call that is very far out, right? 1.5 to 2.5 years. So we'll do maybe December 17, 2027. That's 759 days, a little bit more than 2 years. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look for the 0.85 to 0.95 delta. And this is around 0.88. And what that simulates is we're going to be owning close to 89 shares of TSM. Right? The further in the money you go, like 165, the higher the delta. So this will be 90 shares. So let's just do 165. In order to buy this 165 call option that simulates 90 shares of TSM at its current price, we will be spending close to $13,000. You might think $13,000 is a lot of money, and you're not wrong. But remember, we have to spend $28,000 to buy 100 shares right now, but we are actually only spending $13,000 to buy this one leap that simulates close to 90 shares. So we're actually, quote unquote, saving $15,000 or so. Once this leap is bought, we would be able to sell covered calls on it. So let's assume that right now we have this leaps and we are going to sell one 31-day out call option, and we're trying to generate maybe close to 0.5% a month. So let's just do like this one. So 320. So if I sold this 320 call option, I would collect $215. The yield, just to reiterate, is the credit divided by the sell price. So it'll be 215 divided by 320 times 100, which will come out to be about 0.67%. And essentially, you would do this month after month. If your calls don't get assigned, you would generate income on the leaps call that, again, is simulating you owning 100 shares of TSM. Let's talk about the intricacies of PMCCs, because that is why you guys subscribe to this channel, because we go through the risks and the benefits to make sure you guys understand the trade-offs that is happening here. We have to first examine the outcomes of PMCCs. The first outcome is the easiest. It expires out of the money. So for example, if TSM does not reach above 320 in about 31 days, then sell another call the next month, every single month. This is the tricky part of PMCCs. What happens if the stock continues to go up and your calls start getting under quote unquote attack, right? Because we know from our previous videos about the downsides of covered calls, that I'll link in the upper right hand corner right here, is that the market tends to always drift up. And so it's a higher likelihood that the delta that we're selling for, so in this case, the delta, which is 0.14, which gives us a 14% of being in the money, is actually underestimating the risk. So this 14% is actually more like 30%. So when that happens, or when it gets close to it, there's two options. Number one is you roll. You can keep rolling that call option for a credit. So rolling just means you buy back this current option and you sell another one on top of it. So let's do an example. Let's assume that we have 10 days left on our option and we're selling like a 300 call 130. If I want to roll this out, what I would do is I would spend 130 to buy this option back, and then I would sell a longer dated option, so again 31 days, find the 300 option, and I would collect 550. So 550 minus 130 means on this one roll, I will collect around $420 of income. That's how you would roll. You can also roll up or down. Rolling up just means I go from 300 to maybe 310, right? And here I would collect slightly less, so 345, so I maybe make around $200 or so. Or I roll down to 290 and I collect even more, close to maybe $600 on this one roll. So that's how you would manage it. So theoretically, what would honestly happen in most cases is you would start rolling up, 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 up. And my rule of thumb here is for calls, when you're rolling, do not let it get in the money. If it's getting close to your strike price, roll it out as soon as you can and as fast as possible. That way you can keep that gap as it continues to go up. That's the rolling strategy for covered calls. Number 3 is if it actually ends up going in the money and you can't actually roll for a credit, which means that essentially you'll probably get assigned on the call. Now, assignment is very, very daunting, especially for beginners, and poor man's covered calls, the strategy is probably more tailored to our smaller accounts and beginners anyways. But if it does happen, and it will happen, this is what will happen. So let's assume right now, TSM is actually at 310, and we have this 300 call option. And this is the only one that we sold. So we collected $550. What would happen is our bought call, which we spent $1,390 on, will get exercised. You would choose to buy 100 shares of TSMC at that 165 price point. You would then sell that 100 shares that we bought at 300, which means that you'll bring in $30,000, subtract that by the $16,500 that you spent buying those shares, which means you make out $13,500. Then you subtract the $13,590 that you spent to buy that call option. So you're down negative 90, but you made $550 on the one call option. So essentially you made $460 on this one transaction. So again, that's a little bit complicated. And that is, again, one of the risks that we'll talk a little bit more about poor man's covered call. So one of the things that we talk on this channel is the psychological part. Every time you sell a PMCC, you should expect assignment, because you're on covered calls, it's more likely than not that you're going to get assigned, which means that you will have to sell 100 shares of that stock at some point in time. Let me know if you guys have any comments or questions down in the comment section below, and I'll try and clarify even further. Now let's talk a little bit more about the covered call portion of the PMCC. I want to first bring us back to the risks of selling covered calls, because selling covered calls is actually a lot harder than selling puts. And if you want to learn how to sell puts, make sure you guys check out this video. I'll link in the upper right hand corner. It's a masterclass, 110 minutes on how to sell puts. And the reason for that is because when you're selling covered calls, your upside is capped. We went through this in depth in a separate video that I'll also link right here about the downsides to selling covered calls, aka the devil's bargain. The reason that it's called a devil's bargain is because if a stock were to appreciate and you were to sell a covered call, you are limiting your upside, which means that you are potentially losing out on that capital appreciation, otherwise known as equity risk premium. As an example, take that TSMC call option that we sold. We collected, for example, maybe $300 on it. What happens if TSMC goes 10 points above our strike price? We actually lose out on $700 of gains. And so we are trading income for that potential upside. And that's usually the trade-off when we sell covered calls. And that is especially true when we sell covered calls very close to the money. And the reason that it hurts is because most of the gains in the market comes from capital appreciation, right? The stock growing. And so by cutting off that growth and selling covered calls, you're actually going to have a worse total return than if you just held the stock and did absolutely nothing. So that's the trade-off. Now, the reason you guys subscribe to this channel is because we talk about the risks and the trade-offs, and then we learn how to build our strategy around it. With that being said, there are two main ways to sell covered calls. The first one is that you focus a lot on the capital appreciation. You care a lot about the total returns, right? So the covered call acts as a slight income booster, not as the main driver. The second way is you accept the trade-off of losing out on the capital appreciation. You accept the devil's bargain, and all you care about is selling covered calls for income and getting in and out of your position as fast as possible. Both are fine, as long as you guys understand the trade-offs. So let's just talk about number one first. Our main goal when we sell covered calls is to get a little bit of income while letting our leaps, in this case for PMCCs, grow and appreciate, because that's where most of our returns will come from. And from the devil's bargain paper, what you're going to do and what you're going to see is that we are trying to target 1.2 to 2.4% return annualized. So we are selling very, very, very far out of the money. Now, take, for example, my public account. I have TSMC, and I bought these back in March. So within a span of maybe 8 months, I've already up 52%, right? And TSMC has been a little bit beaten down recently. It will be very, very hard for me to replicate that 52% in terms of income, right? 52 divided by 8 months means that I have to try and get 6% every single month. And so what we want to do when we're selling it with option number one, which is income as a topper, is that we want to let TSMC appreciate as much as possible while adding a little bit of income on top of it. Like we said earlier, what we're trying to do is we're trying to just add at most 2.4% every single month. So the way that we would do this is this way. So we go to the option chain, we sell for the same amount, we sell for 30 days out, and we look at yield, right? 2.4% annualized means you're trying to get around 0.2% every single month. Very, very little, right? So basically trying to sell it at 350 or 340. 340 is around a 2.6% and 350 is closer to 1.7. So I would actually go ahead and just sell this 350. So you can see how far of the money. Again, the goal is not to make as much money as possible. The goal is to let the stock appreciate while just collecting a little bit on top. And so if TSMC, for example, at this very moment where it was at 50%, at the end of the year, with my covered call income, I'll be at like 52.4%. And that 2.4% every single year will make a substantial difference over decades of compounding. That is how you sell it with method number one. Now, method number two is that you accept the trade-off. You accept the bargain, which is that I do not care about the capital appreciation. All I care about is income. Now, in this case, all you have to do is sell it right at the money. So right now, TSMC is at 280. You would go in and sell at 280 or 290. You collect close to 4.5% monthly yield. But the reason that I caution against this, especially for PMCCs, is because we don't actually own the shares, we have the leaps. If you get assigned on your calls, you have to exercise your leaps. And so you have that whole transaction that we talked about earlier on in this video, and that could get a little daunting. And so especially with PMCCs, what I would recommend is actually strategy number one, is because it's just a lot easier, right? You just try to collect as much premium as possible. And if it gets close, like we talked about, roll it. Keep rolling it. And so that the stock, when it drops, you'll be able to get out of it scot-free. If you're selling it very close to the money, as we do in scenario number two, it might be very hard for you to exit the position, which means that you might eventually have to get assigned, end up losing on the position, which is fine, as long as you accept the trade-offs. We talk about all the trade-offs so that you guys can apply it to different scenarios depending on what your overall goal is. You might be in your 30s looking to retire, so you might choose scenario number one because you want to compound a little bit faster. But maybe you're in your 60s and you want to collect as much stable income as possible for your retirement income. Both are completely fine as long as you guys accept what the pros and cons are. And then lastly, let's touch upon what happens if the stock or leaps were to fall in value. So in both circumstances, in both scenarios, whether or not you're income farming as you are in scenario number two, or you're just providing just a little bit of income, in the short term, your calls will be out of the money and you can continue to sell calls at whatever delta you guys are looking at, which means that you won't get assigned. So regardless of which scenario you are, that's actually not a bad thing, especially since your leaps are much cheaper than what it would be if you owned 100 shares. So let's wrap this up with a summary of what a PMCC is. A PMCC is really just a more capital efficient way of selling covered calls, right? So instead of owning 100 shares of that stock, you buy a leaps call that simulates owning that 100 shares. And then you sell covered calls on it to generate just a little bit of income to let that leaps appreciate, or you sell covered calls very aggressively and you try to farm that income. So maybe we'll just use an analogy to kind of bring this full circle. Think of this like buying a house. So instead of paying for that house all at once with straight cash, what you do is you put a down payment on the house and you have a mortgage. So view that down payment as the leaps call. You're simulating owning that house. And then you're able to start renting out the house or rooms on Airbnb or Vrbo. And that room starts generating you income. At the same time, your house should appreciate in value similar to how your leaps appreciate in value. That's about it. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments down in the comment section below. I want to hear stories about how maybe you guys have sold PMCCs, how they've done, some of the issues that you've had, whether or not you like them or don't like them. Big shout out and thank you to my channel members. You guys are the best. Thank you for supporting me the way that you guys do. And if you guys want to learn how to sell puts, again, I'll link it in the end screen right here. And if you guys want to learn my favorite strategy, here's another 110-minute masterclass on how to sell credit spreads. Okay, until next time, stay safe in the market. Peace.